So there's something interesting there so just because there's that focus on compliance and all that kind of suggests that this evolves over time. Obviously these standards change and everything changes. So I'm curious. So, I mean, Kirk, you mentioned you founded Synercom 30 years ago. How has this changed? Like what's the history of pen testing kind of look like? And then since we want to get, a little, philosophical here, where do you see it going?
Well, we used to joke, 10 years ago, Brian and I go out to customers and say, who would ever hire us to do a penetration test? We would do basic audit work, and penetration test was evolving at the leading edge at that point, and customers didn't really think they needed to validate their controls. It was more compliance driven at the time, and we're seeing a trend in the industry to move towards validation is really important. We struggled a lot we were working on a risk assessment app, for example, and we talk about how do we measure risk, and then how do we, we can talk about it all day and we can measure some configurations, but without really validation, we gave a lot of emphasis to that in mitigating risk. And that was something that we see the industry is really heading towards now, is how do you validate things? So how do you, penetration testing is an example of that. Then how do you extend that to teach your people and your processes and tune them to respond better? And then that's getting into things like the adversary simulations we're going to talk about. So those are really the trends that we're seeing that are exciting and fun, because it's, and the other part is the attack surface is getting so big right now. Think about, clouds, and you got your firewalls, and you got all these new technologies like containers, and you've got operational technologies. How do you effectively hit all those surfaces, quickly and apply policies in a timely fashion? And those are a lot of the challenges on the defensive end, and that's what's unique about us, is we're at both the front end where we're trying to get in, but also the controls, and we can work on tuning those with our customers.
Okay. And then, I think that's interesting, and I'm curious to hear. So like Dylan, boots on the ground, so to speak. What did then look like, and what does now look like?
Yeah, so, well, I guess, first few things that come to mind is patch management, right? So when I started in 2010, that was, still kind of a struggle. When I used to get in, inside the network and start doing the internal testing, it was 2010, but I was still looking for, quite often those, servers and systems that were vulnerable to MS-0867. So, that vulnerability was 2 years old at the time. Nowadays, patch management can still be a struggle, but it's matured quite a bit, let's say, overall. Another thing, that comes to mind is a lot of companies explicitly didn't want to include social engineering and phishing during external penetration tests. A lot of companies were still working on maturing their security awareness program, so they would kind of leave, phishing as an additional exercise outside of the penetration test. But nowadays you have things like KnowBe4, and organizations have had 10 years to mature that awareness program. And so it's just included by default that, we're going to do social engineering and phishing.
What I'm hearing...
I'm sorry, what's that?
Apologies, I was cutting you off. Keep going.
Oh yeah, the next thing that comes to mind, even with web applications, there was a huge surge, in 2010. People finally started to realize the importance of doing web application penetration tests. So back then, I used to find a lot of SQL injection all over the place. Of course, cross-site scripting and things like that were just completely rampant. But even just, logic issues and, some kind of oversights and maybe even shortcuts. I used to find like these custom cookies even, where, just by switching your cookie, you could just, switch over to either, an administrative role, or just laterally move to a different client, a different user, things like that. And you still see some of those things today, but a lot of frameworks, have been adopted to help protect against those things, and developers understand the importance of security now. So as applications kind of get rebuilt, back then you still see plenty of applications written in, classic ASP, whereas, most applications nowadays, if they're written on top of Windows, they're using .NET framework, which has a lot of built-in security features and functionality for input validation.
So things have gotten better, it sounds like, but also evolved. And so
Kyle, they've just changed. The landscape's just changed, right? So
just changed?
Oh, gradually over time,
okay.
Right?
Gotcha.
So if we take SQL injection, just for an example, back in 2010, I might not have found that directly in your login page, but within your user registration, other pages, your forgot password feature. Well, once you're logged in, different vulnerabilities, like, okay, if I go to change my password and I send that post request, of course, first I need to put in my current password. So I put that in, I send the post request, and, just change the username for, which should be my user, to a different user. Really low hanging fruit like that. Used to find it pretty often